You know, when I was your age, I didn't have all this privilege that you're always so hateful. I was home working on the book that made you a star.
You know that moment when a celebrity gives a perfectly polished moral speech and people feel tired, not because they hate compassion, but because the performance feels detached from real life. That's the energy behind this whole clash involving J.K. Rowling, Emma Watson, and Bill Maher. It's not really about Harry Potter anymore, and it's not even about one tweet or one interview. It's about privilege, activism, and the modern expectation that everyone must agree on every sensitive topic using the exact right wording, or they get treated like a villain.
Emma is rightly free to disagree with me and indeed to discuss her feelings about me in public. But I have the same right, and I've finally decided to exercise it. I mean, mic drop, Stuber Gear. She could not have said this more perfectly, better, more powerfully, or more in a more damaging way for Emma Watson. She deserved every bit of scorn.
This story makes more sense when you stop looking at it like celebrity gossip and start seeing it as a collision between two realities. One reality is the celebrity activism bubble, where big public statements can be made with very little personal risk. The other reality is the everyday consequences bubble, where cultural and policy shifts affect people who don't have status, security, or a public platform to protect them. Rowling's pushback, in broad terms, is about that gap. Her argument is not simply you're wrong, but your experience is so insulated that you may not understand the trade-offs other people are worried about.
I'm just amazed at how this generation can simultaneously be too sensitive for anything distasteful and somehow also so into eating.
She frames it with a practical example about how famous people move through the world compared to normal people. A celebrity can often have layers of protection, privacy, and support that an average person does not. That matters because it changes how someone experiences public spaces, risk, and vulnerability. If your life is buffered, it's easier to talk in absolutes. It's easier to say this is obviously the correct view and assume the debate is only about morals, not about how rules operate in messy reality. Whether someone agrees with Rowling or not, the core point she's making is easy to understand. Lived experience shapes perception, and privilege can quietly distort how confidently someone speaks about topics that carry real-world consequences for other people. It's getting out of hand day by day, so don't forget to subscribe because you will not believe what the next video will be about. Then Bill Maher steps in, and Maher's role in this story is basically the translator. He takes celebrity politics and turns it into a blunt, plain language critique that people can instantly follow. He's not presenting himself as a policy expert. He's presenting himself as someone who's tired of what he sees as performance masquerading as courage. Maher's argument, at its core, isn't activism is bad. His argument is that a certain kind of activism can become a brand strategy, where public identity matters more than practical outcomes. It's the difference between caring about an issue and building your entire persona around being seen as morally superior.
I respect transgender people. I do not want to treat them like the others. I want them to have rights. I want them to be treated with dignity and respect.
Exactly.
At the same time, I also know what it's like to be a woman living in a state where we've decided self-ID makes the most sense. Okay, well, self-ID doesn't make the most sense. Because obviously, as you and I both know, there are all sorts of predators out there who are going to take advantage of that situation, and that's already happened, right? So there was that big WeSpa story. And it turned out that the so-called transgender woman who was allowed into the women's locker room at a Korean spa in downtown LA was not actually a transgender person, was a person who had a long record of, sexual exploitation and assault.
And when that happens, disagreement stops being normal. It becomes a character judgment. Instead of I disagree with your view, it becomes if you disagree with my view, you're a bad person. Maher frames this as a pattern. Pick a cause, use the most morally certain language possible, signal that you're on the right side, and then treat questions as an attack. In his view, that dynamic doesn't build understanding, it builds tribes. It turns complicated issues into loyalty tests. And once a conversation becomes a loyalty test, nuance becomes dangerous, because nuance looks like weakness to your own side and betrayal to the other side. That's how people end up performing certainty even when reality is complicated. Maher also tries to make a distinction that often gets flattened online. He repeatedly emphasizes that transgender people deserve dignity and respect, and that basic humanity should never be up for debate. But he also argues that policy discussions about privacy, safety, and fairness should be allowed without being automatically treated as hostility. He frames it as a balance problem. It should be possible to support trans rights and still ask practical questions about how rules work in the real world, especially in specific settings where privacy and safety are central concerns. In other words, he's arguing that the conversation should be able to hold two thoughts at once. People deserve respect. Policy design still matters. Those two beliefs do not have to cancel each other out. But Maher's claim is that public discourse often punishes that middle ground.
It's no shame to say, oh, I believe the cover story.
Yeah, I did.
Because the cover story just means that everybody has their own narrative. Nobody pursues the truth on either side. You have to work really hard.
Yes.
Since it's my job, I do, to get the full story. Nobody ever prints the whole. If you read the New York Times and the New York Post, it's like these two, it's just funny to do it.
Because it rewards the loudest and most rigid version of whatever a group wants to hear. That's where he criticizes what he sees as ideological rigidity, not as a gotcha, but as a warning that rigid thinking can produce fragile policies. If a policy is designed around slogans rather than safeguards, it can fail the moment reality hits it. This is where the conversation often brings up high-profile controversies, like the widely discussed spa and locker room incident that circulated in the news and online commentary for a long time. The reason it comes up in these debates isn't because it's supposed to be a statement about transgender people as a group. It shouldn't be treated that way, and framing it that way is exactly how you poison the discussion. The point people try to extract from cases like that is narrower. Any rule without clear safeguards can be misunderstood, misapplied, or exploited by bad actors. That's a reality in every area of law and policy, not just this one. Loopholes attract exploitation. Weak enforcement invites abuse. And when something goes wrong in a highly emotional area, the fallout hits everyone. Women can feel less safe. Transgender people can face backlash they do not deserve. Institutions can lose trust because the public feels like leaders are refusing to address obvious problems. That's why these stories become flashpoints. Not because they represent the norm, but because they reveal how quickly a policy argument turns into a moral panic when nobody is allowed to ask careful questions. In the discussion Maher is involved in, a key moment is when someone admits they initially accepted the early narrative around a story, and later realized the full context was more complicated than the first headlines suggested. That admission matters because it touches the bigger issue Maher keeps returning to: modern media incentives. The argument is that different outlets often emphasize different facts to fit a narrative, and audiences end up feeling recruited instead of informed. People aren't just reading the news anymore. They're being handed a pre-made storyline, and the storyline often depends on which political tribe the outlet serves. Maher jokes that reading one paper and then another can feel like entering two different realities. It's funny, but it's also bleak, because it describes the loss of a shared baseline. If everyone is seeing a different version of reality, then everyone thinks everyone else is lying. And once you get there, trust collapses. Not just trust in media, but trust in institutions, in experts, and even in neighbors. This circles back to Rowling because she becomes, in this framing, a case study in what happens when disagreement turns into moral exile. For years, she was celebrated as a feminist icon. Then she publicly took a stance on sex and gender that many activists strongly disagreed with, and the backlash became intense and personal. The point being made in this type of commentary is not criticism is illegal or people must agree with her. The point is that online culture often turns disagreement into total moral condemnation, leaving almost no room for good faith debate. Maher frames this as performative purity, where social status can come from outrage and public shaming becomes a substitute for persuasion. In that environment, the incentive is not to explain your view clearly or test it against reality. The incentive is to prove you're one of the good people by publicly punishing the designated wrong people. And that's how discourse becomes toxic. It becomes less about solving anything and more about signaling your moral membership card. Maher argues that real courage, at least culturally, isn't repeating the safest opinion that gets applause. Real courage is holding a position calmly when it becomes unpopular. People will interpret that differently depending on their politics. Supporters call it integrity. Critics call it stubbornness. But either way, it becomes symbolic in a world where many public figures retreat the moment backlash hits. This is part of why Rowling remains such a lightning rod. Not because everyone agrees with her, but because she represents refusal. And refusal is rare in a culture built around compliance and fear. The conversation then expands into other institutions because the same cultural habits show up everywhere. It shows up in universities, where there are debates over whether education should prioritize comfort or challenge, Maher and people who think like him argue that education is meant to expose you to ideas you don't like, not protect you from them. They argue that discomfort is not the same as harm, and that treating adults like fragile children produces a society that cannot handle disagreement. If someone's worldview collapses the moment they hear an opposing opinion, that isn't strength, and it isn't progress. It's fragility dressed up as virtue. The discussion also extends into entertainment and comedy, because comedy is one of the few arenas that still test boundaries, and boundary testing drives certain activist cultures crazy. Comedy doesn't work if it has to pass through a committee of approved language. It's supposed to be risky. It's supposed to poke. It's supposed to reveal contradictions. That's why comedy becomes a battleground. There are repeated examples of people trying to pressure companies to remove content they dislike, and leaders sometimes responding with a simple point: you don't have to like everything, but disagreement is not the same as erasure. That's not an argument that comedy is always right. It's an argument that a healthy society can tolerate offense without turning everything into punishment. The larger takeaway being presented is that society is stuck between real accountability and performative virtue. Real accountability is about outcomes, about harm prevention, about workable rules, and about honest conversation. Performative virtue is about optics, applause, and public purity tests. Performance gets likes and approval, but it does not automatically create better policy, better institutions, or better outcomes. The reason this story resonates is that many people feel trapped in a culture where asking practical questions gets treated like malice, where slogans are treated like solutions, and where the first headline is treated like final truth even when later context complicates it. People feel like they're being ordered to clap along, and if they don't, they're labeled. That's the emotional fuel behind these debates. Rowling's position, as framed here, is not protect me from criticism. It's that if others can criticize her publicly, she can respond publicly, and disagreement should not automatically lead to attempts to destroy someone's reputation or livelihood. That principle, the right to disagree without destruction, is what many people feel is collapsing. Maher's closing theme is that too many issues have become identity tests, and the middle ground gets punished. If you say trans people deserve respect, some people assume you endorse every policy proposal without question. If you say women deserve sex-based privacy in some spaces, some people assume you're hostile. The worst assumptions get assigned instantly, and then nobody talks, they just fight. Maher argues that outrage is not the same thing as morality, and that society needs more room for honest discussion, more room for humor, and more room for policies that can survive real-world complexity. Because complexity is not bigotry. Complexity is reality. This Rowling versus Watson moment, in this safer framing, is not presented as a petty feud, but as a cultural crossroads. Do we want moral performance to dominate everything, where the loudest certainty wins and everyone else stays silent? Or do we want a culture that can handle disagreement, trade-offs, and nuance without turning every conflict into a total war? That question is bigger than Hollywood and bigger than Harry Potter, because it reflects a wider struggle over trust, language, and how a society debates difficult topics without collapsing into tribal warfare. And that's why this story keeps resurfacing. Not because people are obsessed with celebrities, although they are, but because the underlying tension isn't going away. People want respect and fairness for everyone. People also want rules that work in the real world. People want media they can trust. People want institutions that aren't scared to talk honestly. And they want a culture where asking a question doesn't automatically make you a villain. That is the real reason this clip format spreads. It's not just drama, it's a mirror. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to press the subscribe button because we have much more to uncover.